Welcome to Backyard Wrench Bender, where I document my backyard mechanic shenanigans and post it online for you to enjoy, and hopefully encourage you to get out there and work on that project you've been letting sit for a while. Today, we're turning this old rusty leaf spring into this. Let me show you how. As I mentioned in my last video, I've got this old trailer that I'm rebuilding. It's an old 68 Ford F-250 truck bed trailer. So before we dig into this spring, I want to get a couple things out of the way. First, I've already done one of them. I took the time to do one to figure out all the ins and outs and all the details, but I recommend if you're going to do a project like this, do them one at a time. Because once you get all that hardware off, if you forget where a nut goes or you're not sure exactly how it goes, you have the second one to look at. The second point is, build to what your project needs. This thing is a trailer, so it doesn't need to be comfortable, and it just needs to be able to haul things. So that being said, I didn't worry about replacing bushings. I reused the original hardware. If this was an actual 68 F-250 I was restoring, I probably would have spent the little extra money to put new bushings and parts on. But since this is just a trailer and I'm trying to do this relatively inexpensively, I opted to just use the bushings that were on it. I opted to clean the hardware up and reuse that. As we go, if you see something that I didn't replace that you would have, leave a comment and let me know why. And the final note I'd like to point out is you can do this to any set of leaf springs. Doesn't matter if it's Ford, Chevy, Dodge. It'll even work on the Mustang rear springs. But this is just a cosmetic rebuild. If your springs are worn out and they're sagging, this will do nothing for that. I know Mustangs have a common issue of sagging rear end because their rear leaves wear out. So if your springs are worn out, you just gotta bite the bullet and replace them. If your springs are fine, but they just look bad, this is a quick and easy project. So, that being said, let's get into it.
First thing we need to do is take the shackles off of the springs. The top stud was spinning, which it wasn't supposed to, so I decided to move on to the bottom one first. Unfortunately, my impact driver did not have the power it needed to get it off, so I switched over to the breaker bar. When doing a project like this, make sure you use a lot of penetrating oil, and be prepared to put a little bit of elbow grease into this. It's obvious these bolts have been on here for a long time and they do not want to come off. And after about a minute of fighting with it, it finally came loose and I was able to spin it off. For the top bolt, I tried using vice grips to keep the stud from spinning, but I just couldn't get the leverage I needed on it. So to get the leverage I need, I put my rusty spring in my freshly painted frame and tried from there, but the vice grips weren't strong enough to hold it. What I ended up having to do is take the spring over to my welder and put a booger weld on the back of this so that the stud wouldn't spin anymore. Once I did that, I was able to break torque and come and remove the bolt. If you're going to try a project like this and you don't have a welder, you can just take your stud down to a local hardware store and replace it with a hex head bolt the same size. Just make sure you do a grade 5 or better, and that will hold up just fine. And this old shackle needed some persuasion to come apart. That lower bolt ended up being a pain in the butt, and I had to fight with it for a good 20-30 minutes, but I did finally get it out.
Alright, let's talk about this guy for a minute. So the metal sleeve inside the bushing melted to the bushing. You kind of see right there, it's all bushing melted into that gap there. So it didn't want to come out. This comes back to point number 2 from the beginning of the video. If I were restoring a truck that I was actually driving in, I'd get new bushings for this. But you have to consider what are bushings for. All they're really for is to make the ride more comfortable. I'm not going to be riding in this trailer. It's going to be used for hauling stuff. I don't need it to be comfortable. So I'm going to go ahead and reuse this bushing, force this back in there just as I forced it out, I did price out new bushings for this, and I found one company that had a fairly reasonable price. This spring setup requires 4 bushings per spring, and I found a company that was offering all 8 bushings for about $67, which is reasonable, but they had a 3-month lead time, and I'm not willing to wait 3 months just to get this thing back on the road. So if I drive this thing around and decide that I do need to replace those bushings, I'll get some on order and I'll replace them when they get in.
Once you got the shackle out, you go ahead and take out the rest of the hardware. I included this section of video so you can see how I went about doing it. Sometimes this old rusty hardware requires creative solutions to get it out.
Before I go any further on this, I feel I should tell you, this is under spring tension. So as soon as I pull this nut off, these springs are going to want to bounce away from each other. So before you completely loosen that bolt, put a clamp on it so it doesn't bounce all over the place and end up hurting you.
Once all the hardware is removed, take a sledgehammer and tap on the brackets on the lower spring. The idea is to move the lower spring out far enough that you can pull the middle 2 springs out. Once separated, you need to make sure you clean up all the springs. I'm using a bench grinder with a wire attachment. You can use an angle grinder with a wire attachment. You can use hand brushes and elbow grease. Whatever you need to do to clean these things up to a level that you're comfortable with. And once I'm finished with the grinder, I come back and wipe everything down with the solvent to get off any extra rust powder or dirt that might be there. And then we come back and hit it with paint and primer.
While those dry, I'll take a minute to tell you what I'm using. For a primer, I'm using the Rust-Oleum Rust Reformer. I'll be honest, I don't know if it really works, but I like the idea, so hopefully it does. And then for paint, I'm going to come back and I'm just using a Rust Stop Satin Black. This is an oil-based enamel. I will say there's a chance that as the suspension flexes, this could crack. I'm really not concerned with it. If that's something that you are concerned about, you might want to go with a different type of paint. I chose this because it was what was available at the time. So. Alright, we got these all painted up. And while they're drying, let's go take care of that hardware.
I placed all the hardware in a rust dissolver and let it soak while I was painting the springs. As you can see, I also have the spring brackets soaking in there as well. With this rust dissolver, the longer you let it soak, the better it's going to work. So once they're ready, you pull it out of the dissolver and you use a wire brush and clean everything off.
So now that the hardware is all cleaned, the springs are all painted, there's one last step I do before putting it back together. I'm going to take some dry lube and spray in between the areas that are going to be contacting. This step isn't necessary, but this gives a little lubrication while the springs are flexing, and it can help prevent some wear and tear. So once everything's been painted and lubed up, you can go ahead and put it back together the way you took it apart. One thing to note, this hole is offset to one side. So when you put it back together, make sure all the holes are offset to the same side.
Once you get all the springs together, grab a screwdriver to make sure all the holes line up. This will make it easier to put it back together. And this is evidence I need to get a new impact driver. The little one I have just isn't quite enough for the high torque applications. So, as usual, use what you got to get the job done. And this is the part of the video where I act like I know what I'm doing, but in all reality I forgot to look up torque values before I came out, so while you won't see me use a torque wrench, I will come back and torque these after I go look those numbers up. And as a final touch, I go back with some paint and I paint all the hardware to make sure that it is corrosion resistant as well. And there you go. Good as new. This spring is ready to be put back on the frame. But as things go, I've run out of time. So that'll have to happen later. You have a good weekend and we'll see you next time.